to drink the water in front of everyone seated here.
She was known among the crew for being particular. That's what they called it. Particular about procedures, particular about passenger behavior, particular about who deserved her time and attention. Some of the other flight attendants had learned not to question her methods. She'd picture this. A 7-year-old girl stands in the narrow aisle of an airplane, 30,000 feet above the ground, holding a plastic cup filled with water. Her small hands are trembling, but her voice cuts through the cabin like a blade. Every passenger within earshot has gone completely silent. The flight attendant in front of her, a woman with 15 years of experience in a polished uniform, has gone pale, her carefully maintained composure cracking like ice under pressure. The little girl's name is Nova, and she's just said 5 words that will destroy a career, spark a lawsuit, and expose an ugly truth that still happens in our skies. I dare you to drink that water if you're innocent. The flight attendant, Blake, stares at the cup. Her lips part. She reaches for it then stops. Her hand falls to her side. She cannot drink it. She will not drink it. And in her refusal, in that single moment of silence, everything unravels. What happened on Flight 447 would make headlines across the country. It would force an airline to answer questions they'd been avoiding for years. It would reveal just how far prejudice can go when people think no one is watching. But to understand how we got to this moment, to understand why a second grader had to become the voice of justice at 30,000 feet, we need to go back. Back to where it all started. Back to a mother and daughter who just wanted to get home. Rain was 32 years old and she was exhausted. Not the kind of tired that comes from a bad night's sleep, but the bone-deep weariness of a woman who'd been fighting uphill for most of her life. She was 6 months pregnant, her belly round and tight beneath the simple blue dress she wore. Her ankles were swollen, pushing against the straps of her flats. Every step through the airport had been an effort, but she'd pushed through because that's what Rain did. She pushed through. She worked as a nurse at a county hospital, pulling double shifts when she could because childcare was expensive and babies needed things. So many things. She'd been saving for months for this trip, counting every dollar, skipping lunches, saying no to Nova when her daughter asked for things that other kids had. Not because she didn't want to give her the world, but because the world was expensive and Rain was doing this alone. Her mother was sick. Cancer, stage 3, fighting it in Atlanta while Rain fought her own battles hundreds of miles away. This trip was necessary. Essential. Rain needed to see her mother, needed Nova to spend time with the grandmother who might not be there when the new baby arrived. So she'd scraped together the money for 2 economy tickets and told herself it would be worth it. The discomfort would be worth it. Beside her, buckled into the middle seat, was the reason Rain kept fighting. Nova was 7 years old, but she had the awareness of someone much older. It happens sometimes with kids who grew up watching their mothers struggle. They learn to read the room, to notice the small things, to understand when to be quiet and when to speak up. Nova had her mother's dark eyes and her grandmother's stubborn chin. She loved science, asked endless questions about how things worked, why the sky was blue, what made airplanes stay in the air, where babies came from. Rain had answered that last one honestly, age-appropriately, because Nova deserved honesty. And when Rain had sat her down 3 months ago and explained that there was a baby growing inside her, that Nova was going to be a big sister, something had shifted in the little girl. She'd become protective, watchful. She noticed when her mother winced. She offered to carry the groceries. She drew pictures of the 3 of them, soon to be 4, always with huge smiles on their faces. Right now, Nova was noticing that her mother was uncomfortable. Rain's breathing had gotten shallow, and she kept shifting in her seat, trying to find a position that didn't make her back ache or her bladder scream. The airplane seat seemed designed to maximize discomfort, and pregnancy made everything worse. Nova reached into her small backpack and pulled out her tablet, the one Rain had gotten her for Christmas, refurbished but functional. She offered it to her mother without a word. Rain smiled, touched her daughter's cheek. She didn't take the tablet. She needed Nova to have distractions on this flight. Instead, she closed her eyes and tried to breathe through the discomfort. They'd be in the air for 4 hours. She could manage 4 hours. She'd managed worse. Flight 447 was packed. It was a cross-country flight on a Friday afternoon, the kind that airlines loved because they could fill every seat and maximize profit. Economy class was a study in human tolerance, passengers crammed into spaces that seemed to shrink every year. The air was recycled, carrying that particular airplane smell of cleaning chemicals and other people's lunches. The engines hummed, a constant drone that some people found soothing and others found maddening. Rain and Nova were in the middle seats of a middle row, the worst possible location. No window to look out of, no aisle for easy bathroom access. just enclosed on both sides by strangers. To their right, across the aisle, sat a man in his 40s, wearing an expensive suit and absorbed in his laptop. His name was River, though Rain didn't know that yet. He had the look of someone important, someone used to business class who'd been downgraded and wasn't happy about it. But his eyes, when he glanced up, weren't unkind. Behind them sat an elderly woman with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her name was Lumi, and she had the kind of face that looked like it smiled often, creases around her eyes that spoke of a lifetime of laughter. She was watching Nova with quiet interest, the way grandmothers do when they see a child who reminds them of someone they love. The flight attendants were making their way through the cabin, doing the initial safety check, ensuring seat belts were fastened and bags were stowed. There were 3 of them working this section. The first was a young man, probably mid-20s, with an easy smile and gentle hands as he helped an older passenger with their overhead bag. His name tag read Jet. He was newer to the job, you could tell by the way he actually made eye contact with passengers, the way he hadn't yet learned to see them as problems to be managed rather than people to be helped. And then there was Blake. Blake was the lead flight attendant, and she wore her authority like armor. 38 years old with 15 years at the airline, she moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency. Her uniform was immaculate, her hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her face, her makeup applied with precision. Everything about her screamed professional, competent, in control. But there was something in her eyes, something cold and assessing, that made people instinctively look away. Been there longer. She knew how things worked. And if she occasionally made certain passengers' flights more difficult than others, well, that was between her and her conscience. Blake made her way down the aisle, checking seat belts with quick, efficient tugs. She barely looked at the passengers' faces, just the mechanical confirmation that they'd followed instructions. But when she reached row 23, when she reached Rain and Nova, something changed. Her eyes lingered. Just a fraction of a second too long. Her gaze moved from Rain's face to her pregnant belly to Nova's small form pressed against her mother's side, and something flickered in her expression. It was so subtle that most people wouldn't have noticed. Just a slight tightening around her mouth, a coolness in her eyes that hadn't been there a moment before. But Nova noticed. Nova was 7 years old and she noticed everything. She watched as Blake's jaw tightened, as her movements became just a touch more abrupt when she checked their seat belts. She saw the way Blake's eyes swept over them with something that wasn't quite contempt but wasn't far from it either. And Nova felt something twist in her stomach, an instinct she couldn't name but knew enough to trust. Blake moved on without a word. No smile, no welcome aboard, no asking if they needed anything. Just the cold efficiency of someone doing the minimum required and nothing more. Rain either didn't notice or was too tired to care. She'd experienced worse. Much worse. A flight attendant's cold shoulder barely registered on the scale of indignity she'd endured. But Nova kept watching. She watched as Blake stopped at the next row, where an older white couple sat, and her entire demeanor changed. The smile appeared. The warm tone. The extra moment taken to ensure they were comfortable. Nova was 7 years old, but she understood what she was seeing. She'd seen it before. At stores. At her school. In the way some people looked at her mother versus how they looked at other mothers. The plane began to taxi toward the runway. The safety demonstration started, flight attendants miming the placement of oxygen masks and the location of exits. Rain closed her eyes. Nova held her tablet but didn't turn it on. She was thinking about the way Blake had looked at them. She was thinking about the long flight ahead. And somewhere in her 7-year-old mind, a small alarm bell was starting to ring. She didn't know yet what was coming. She couldn't have imagined what would happen in the next few hours. But Nova was her mother's daughter, and her mother had taught her to trust her instincts. Right now, her instincts were telling her to pay attention. To watch carefully. Because something about the woman in the perfect uniform with the cold eyes felt wrong. The engines roared. The plane lifted into the sky. And Flight 447 began its journey toward a confrontation that would change everything. If you're already hooked by this story and want to see how Nova's bravery exposes the truth, make sure to hit that subscribe button right now, because what happens next will leave you absolutely speechless. But here's what I want to know from you. Have you ever witnessed someone being treated unfairly and had to decide whether to speak up or stay silent? Drop your experience in the comments below, because what 7-year-old Nova does in the face of injustice might just inspire you to be braver the next time you see something wrong. The plane had been in the air for about 20 minutes when Rain realized just how thirsty she was. It wasn't the normal kind of thirst you could ignore for a while. This was the desperate, throat-closing kind that pregnancy brought on without warning. Her mouth felt like cotton. Her lips were dry. The baby seemed to be pressing on everything inside her, and all she could think about was water. Cold, clean water. She waited for Blake to pass by, not wanting to be demanding, not wanting to cause trouble. Rain had learned long ago that when you're a black woman moving through the world, you have to be twice as polite to get half the consideration. So when Blake finally came down the aisle, checking on passengers, Rain raised her hand gently, a small, apologetic gesture. Blake stopped, her expression neutral but not warm. Rain gave her most pleasant smile, the one she used at the hospital when dealing with difficult doctors. She kept her voice soft, non-threatening. She explained that she was 6 months pregnant and feeling quite dehydrated. She asked politely if she could possibly get some water. Blake's response came quickly, almost before Rain had finished speaking. Her tone was just slightly too curt, just on the edge of professional rudeness that couldn't quite be called out but could definitely be felt. She said they'd be coming through with the beverage service soon. Then she walked away, her shoes clicking efficiently down the aisle, not looking back. Rain told herself it was fine. Soon meant soon, right? Maybe 15 minutes. 20 at most. She could wait. She'd waited for much worse things in her life. She settled back in her seat, swallowed against the dryness in her throat, and tried to focus on something else. Nova squeezed her hand, a small gesture of solidarity that made Rain's heart ache with love. But 15 minutes passed. Then 20. Then 30. The cabin felt warmer now, or maybe that was just Rain's body temperature rising. Pregnancy did that, made you feel like you were running hot all the time, like there was a furnace inside you burning through resources faster than you could replenish them. She kept glancing toward the galley, waiting to see the beverage cart emerge. It didn't come. 40 minutes after she'd first asked, Rain was starting to feel genuinely unwell. Her head was beginning to pound with the early signs of dehydration. Her skin felt clammy. Nova kept looking up at her with worried eyes, those dark, observant eyes that missed nothing. Rain tried to smile reassuringly, but she could feel sweat beading on her forehead despite the air conditioning blasting from the overhead vent. Nova noticed her mother getting paler. She noticed the way Rain's hand kept moving to her stomach, the protective gesture she made when something was wrong. She noticed the slight tremor in her mother's fingers. And 7-year-old Nova, who loved her mother more than anything in the world, who'd promised herself she'd take care of her mom and the new baby, made a decision. She reached up and pressed the call button. The chimes sounded above them, a polite ding that signaled someone needed assistance. Rain started to tell Nova it was okay, they could wait, but Nova shook her head firmly. She'd seen her mother put everyone else's comfort before her own too many times. Not this time. Not when her mom was pregnant and clearly suffering. It wasn't Blake who responded. It was Jet, the younger flight attendant with the kind eyes. He appeared quickly, leaning down with genuine concern on his face. He asked what they needed. Before Rain could downplay it, could say never mind, Nova spoke up. She explained that her mom had asked for water almost an hour ago and was pregnant and not feeling well. Jet's expression immediately shifted to alarm. He apologized profusely, said he had no idea they'd been waiting, and disappeared toward the galley. He was back in less than 2 minutes with a full bottle of water and a cup of ice. He asked Rain if she needed anything else, crackers, ginger ale for the nausea, anything at all. Rain accepted the water gratefully, her hands shaking slightly as she opened it and drank. The cold liquid felt like salvation going down her throat. Jet apologized again for the delay, said it shouldn't have happened, and told Rain to press the call button anytime she needed something. His kindness was so genuine, so immediate, that it made the earlier dismissal from Blake feel even worse by contrast. From the galley, Blake was watching this entire interaction. Her jaw was tight, her eyes narrowed. After Jet walked away, she turned to another flight attendant, a woman named Arden who'd been working the forward cabin. Arden had come back to grab supplies and caught the tail end of the water situation. Blake's voice was low but sharp enough for Arden to hear clearly. She said something about passengers thinking they ran a personal service, as if asking for water on a 4-hour flight was an unreasonable demand. There was contempt in her tone, barely disguised disdain. Arden looked uncomfortable, her eyes darting away. She didn't respond, didn't challenge it. She just grabbed what she needed and moved back toward the front of the plane, and Blake's expression settled into something cold and satisfied. But Rain was already starting to feel a bit better. The water was helping. The headache was receding. She thanked Jet again when he passed by a few minutes later, and he gave her a warm smile that reminded her that most people were decent. She tried to forget about Blake's coldness, tried to focus on the fact that they'd get to Atlanta in a few hours and she'd see her mother and everything would be okay. An hour into the flight, turbulence hit. It wasn't the gentle bumping that experienced travelers barely notice. This was the kind that made the plane drop suddenly, that sent bags rattling in the overhead compartments and caused passengers to grip their armrests with white knuckles. The seatbelt sign dinged on urgently. The captain's voice came over the intercom, asking everyone to remain seated and buckled. For Rain, the turbulence triggered something immediate and undeniable. Pregnancy had done a number on her bladder, and the sudden drops and jolts made her realize with panic that she needed a bathroom. Not soon. Right now. The urgency was overwhelming, the kind that made her break out in a cold sweat. She waited for a break in the turbulence for the seatbelt sign to turn off. It felt like forever but was probably only 10 minutes. The moment the light dinged off, she unbuckled carefully and made her way down the aisle, one hand on the seats for balance, the other protectively over her belly. The bathroom was mercifully unoccupied. She slipped inside, grateful for the moment of privacy. When she emerged a few minutes later, she felt worse, not better. The turbulence, the stress, the earlier dehydration, all of it was catching up with her. Her face had gone from pale to nearly gray. Her hands were trembling. She made her way back to her seat, moving slowly, and when she sat down, Nova immediately knew something was very wrong. Rain was trying to breathe through waves of nausea. The pregnancy had brought morning sickness that sometimes hit at random times, especially when she was stressed or dehydrated. Right now, her stomach was churning and she felt lightheaded and clammy. She needed water again. Maybe some crackers to settle her stomach. Something to make this bearable. She didn't want to press the call button again. Didn't want to be a burden. But Nova saw her mother's distress and reached up without hesitation, pressing it firmly. The chime sounded. Rain whispered that it was okay, they could wait, but Nova ignored her. Her mother needed help, and Nova wasn't going to let pride or politeness stop her from making sure she got it. This time it was Blake who responded. She appeared in the aisle, and her demeanor was immediately icy. There was no pretense of warmth, no customer service smile. She looked down at Rain and Nova with thinly veiled irritation, her posture rigid, her expression cold. She asked what they needed now, and there was definite emphasis on that last word. No. As if they'd been pestering her all flight. Rain, trying to keep her voice steady despite the nausea, explained that she was feeling sick and asked if she could please have some more water and maybe some crackers if they had any. Her tone was apologetic, almost pleading. She hated how small her voice sounded, but she genuinely felt terrible and just needed basic assistance. Blake's response was immediate and loud enough that people in nearby rows could hear. She said the beverage service was over. Rain would have to wait until the next round. Her tone suggested this was final, non-negotiable, and slightly absurd that Rain was even asking. Nova, sitting right there watching this woman dismiss her mother's clear distress, felt something rise in her chest. She was 7 years old, but she understood injustice when she saw it. She spoke up, her voice small but determined. She said her mom was pregnant and not feeling good. Blake turned her attention to Nova, and what she said next was delivered louder than necessary, projecting across multiple rows. She announced that everyone on this plane had needs. Rain wasn't special. The implication was clear and humiliating. Stop acting entitled, stop demanding extra attention, wait your turn like everyone else. Several passengers turned to look. Some with curiosity, some with disapproval, though it wasn't clear if the disapproval was directed at Rain for asking or at Blake for responding so harshly. River, the businessman across the aisle, glanced up from his laptop, his brow furrowing. Lumi, behind them, had stopped reading her book entirely. Rain felt her face burn with embarrassment. She reached over and gently touched Nova's arm, telling her daughter in a quiet voice that it was okay, they could wait, it was fine. But her voice cracked slightly on the word fine, betraying just how not fine she actually was. Nova looked up and saw something that broke her heart. There were tears gathering in her mother's eyes. Rain was blinking rapidly, trying to keep them from falling, but Nova saw them. She saw her mother's humiliation, her physical distress, her desperate attempt to hold everything together. And something hardened in that 7-year-old girl. Something crystallized into steel. Her mother was the strongest person she knew. Her mother worked double shifts, raised her alone, never complained, always pushed through. And this woman in the uniform was treating her like she was nothing. Like she didn't matter. Like her suffering was an inconvenience. Blake walked away, her shoes clicking sharply against the floor, leaving Rain trembling in her seat and Nova vibrating with an anger she'd never felt before. Another 20 minutes passed. Rain's condition wasn't improving. If anything, it was getting worse. The nausea had intensified. She was holding her stomach, one hand pressed against the spot where the baby was, breathing in short, shallow gasps. She was trying so hard not to make a scene, not to draw attention, but her body was betraying her. Sweat had soaked through the collar of her dress. Her lips had gone pale. Nova was terrified. She'd never seen her mother look like this. She wanted to press the call button again, but she was afraid Blake would come back and make things worse. She felt helpless, a terrible feeling for a child who'd promised herself she'd protect her mom. That's when she felt a gentle tap on her shoulder. Nova turned around to find Lumi, the elderly woman who'd been sitting behind them, leaning forward with concern etched in every line of her kind face. Lumi had been watching this situation unfold with growing distress. She'd heard the earlier interaction with Blake. She'd seen Rain's deterioration. And she couldn't sit by anymore. Lumi held out her own water bottle, nearly full, and offered it to Nova. Her voice was soft but urgent. She told Nova to give it to her mother. Rain needed water, and whatever was happening with that flight attendant, it didn't matter more than Rain's health. Nova took the bottle with shaking hands, overwhelmed with gratitude. She immediately offered it to Rain, who looked at Lumi with tears now openly falling, thanking her in a whisper. Rain unscrewed the cap with trembling fingers and had just brought the bottle to her lips when Blake appeared as if summoned by radar. She must have been watching them from the galley because she arrived with alarming speed, her expression thunderous. Blake's voice cut through the cabin. She announced that passengers were not permitted to share food or beverages. Health regulations. Her tone suggested she'd caught them doing something dangerous and irresponsible. Before Rain could even respond, before she could explain or protest, Blake reached down and took the water bottle directly from Rain's hands. Just plucked it away like confiscating contraband from a child. Lumi started to protest, saying the woman was clearly unwell, but Blake spoke over her. River, the businessman who'd been growing increasingly disturbed by what he was witnessing, set his laptop aside and spoke up. His voice was firm, authoritative in a way that suggested he was used to being heard. He said she was pregnant and clearly not well, and asked Blake to have some compassion. Blake turned on him immediately. She told him not to interfere with crew duties, her voice sharp with warning. She said if he continued, she'd have to report this as a disturbance. The threat was clear. Shut up or face consequences. River's jaw tightened, but he was also a black man on an airplane, and he knew the dangers of being labeled a disturbance. He sat back, but his eyes never left Blake's face, and they were filled with disgust. Rain, humiliated beyond measure, desperate beyond pride, looked up at Blake. Her voice cracked when she spoke. She said please. She just needed some water. She was so thirsty. It was the voice of someone begging, someone stripped of dignity, someone reduced to pleading for basic human decency. There was a long moment of silence. Blake stood there, still holding Lumi's confiscated water bottle, looking down at Rain with an expression that was impossible to read. Several passengers were watching now, the confrontation having drawn attention throughout the surrounding rows. The air felt thick with tension. Finally Blake spoke. Fine. She'd get Rain water. Her voice was clipped, cold, but she said the words. She'd get the water. She turned and walked toward the galley, and everyone seemed to exhale slightly. Lumi patted Nova's shoulder reassuringly. River gave Rain a small nod of solidarity. Rain slumped in her seat, exhausted by the interaction, just grateful that she'd finally get what she needed. But Nova felt something entirely different. She watched Blake's retreating figure, watched the set of her shoulders, the tension in her spine. She heard the tone in which Blake had said those words. Fine. I'll get you water. And Nova's stomach dropped. It was the way Blake had said it. The edge in her voice. The something lurking beneath the surface of those words. Nova was 7 years old, but she'd developed instincts living in a world that wasn't always kind to people who looked like her and her mother. Those instincts were screaming at her now. Something was wrong. Something about the way Blake had given and felt off. It didn't feel like compassion. It didn't even feel like grudging compliance. It felt like something else entirely. It felt like retaliation. Nova's heart started beating faster. She watched the galley area, that small space where flight attendants prepared drinks and snacks. She couldn't see inside from where she sat, but her mind was racing. What was Blake doing in there? Why did this feel wrong? Rain had her eyes closed, one hand on her belly, the other gripping the armrest. She was so focused on fighting the nausea and dizziness that she wasn't paying attention to anything else. She was just waiting for relief, trusting that it was coming. Believing that despite the cruelty she'd experienced, despite the humiliation, at least now she'd get the basic necessity of water. But Nova wasn't relaxed. Nova was watching. And what she was about to witness would turn this flight into a nightmare, would expose a truth so ugly that it would make national news, and would force a 7-year-old to make a choice between staying silent and speaking up against an adult in a position of power. The stakes were about to get much, much higher. And Nova, whether she was ready or not, was about to become the only thing standing between her mother and something unthinkable. If you can already feel the anger rising at how Rain is being treated and you want to see what happens when Nova discovers the horrifying truth, hit that subscribe button right now because what's coming next will shock you to your core. And let me ask you this. If you were Nova, sitting there watching your mother being treated this way, what would you do? Would you stay quiet like you've been taught, or would you find the courage to stand up? Tell me in the comments, because Nova's about to make a choice that most adults wouldn't have the bravery to make. Blake disappeared into the galley, and for a moment the tension in the cabin seemed to ease slightly. Rain sat with her eyes closed, waiting. Trusting. She had no reason not to trust. Despite everything, despite the coldness and the cruelty, she believed that a flight attendant would still do the basic job of providing safe drinking water. That's where her mind was. That's what she expected. But Nova couldn't shake the feeling twisting in her gut. She watched the galley area with laser focus, that instinct of wrongness growing stronger with each passing second. The galley curtain wasn't fully closed. There was a gap, just a small opening, and Nova's curious nature, the same curiosity that made her ask endless questions about how things worked, drew her attention to that gap. She leaned slightly into the aisle, angling her head to see through the opening. At first she couldn't make out much. Just movement. Blake's figure moving around in the small space. But then Blake shifted, and Nova's angle changed, and what she saw made her blood run absolutely cold. Blake wasn't at the beverage station. She wasn't pulling water from the normal supply that passengers drank from. She was standing near the small bathroom adjacent to the galley, the one reserved for crew. And she was filling a cup with water from a tap that Nova recognized. Nova knew exactly what that tap was because earlier in the flight, during the comm before everything went wrong, she'd asked Jet about airplane water systems. It had been innocent curiosity, the kind of question Nova asked about everything. When Jet had brought her mother that first bottle of water, Nova had asked him where airplane water came from. Did they fill up tanks before the flight? Was it filtered? How did it all work? And Jet, kind and patient, had explained. He told her that drinking water on planes came from sealed bottles or filtered tanks that were regularly serviced and tested. But he'd also mentioned, because Nova had specifically asked about the bathrooms, that there was a separate system for the lavatories. A gray water system. He'd explained that the tap water in airplane bathrooms wasn't for drinking. It was used to service the waste system, to rinse, to flush. It wasn't potable. It wasn't safe. Nova had filed that information away in her 7-year-old brain, the way she filed away everything she learned. She liked knowing how things worked. It made the world make sense. But now, watching through that gap in the curtain, she saw Blake filling a cup from that exact tap. The bathroom tap. The one that serviced the toilet waste system. The one Jet had specifically said wasn't for drinking. Nova's heart stopped. Literally stopped for a beat before it started racing so fast she thought it might explode out of her chest. She watched, frozen in horror, as Blake finished filling the cup, turned off the tap, and then stood there for a moment looking at the cup in her hand. There was something in Blake's expression, something dark and satisfied, that made Nova feel sick. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a mistake. Blake knew exactly what she was doing. Blake composed herself, smoothed her uniform, arranged her face into a neutral expression, and then turned toward the curtain. Nova jerked back into her seat, her mind screaming, her hands shaking. She looked at her mother, who still had her eyes closed, still waiting for relief, completely unaware of what was coming. Blake emerged from the galley holding the cup. She walked down the aisle with that same practiced efficiency, her expression now arranged into something that almost resembled professional courtesy. She stopped at their row, reached across, and set the cup down on Rain's tray table with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. Her words were perfectly polite, perfectly professional. She said, "Your water, ma'am. Enjoy." Rain's eyes opened. She saw the cup, saw the clear liquid inside, and her face flooded with relief and gratitude. Her hand reached out, trembling slightly from exhaustion and dehydration. She was so thirsty. The cup was right there. Salvation was right there. Her fingers wrapped around it, began to lift it toward her lips. And Nova's hand shot out like lightning, grabbing the cup before it could reach her mother's mouth. The water sloshed but didn't spill. Rain jerked back, startled, confusion flooding her face. Nova held the cup tightly, her small fingers white-knuckled around it, her whole body rigid with fear and fury and desperate protective instinct. She didn't know what toilet water could do to a pregnant woman. She didn't know the specifics of bacteria or contamination, but she knew deep in her bones that her mother could not drink this. Blake's voice cut through the moment, sharp and authoritative. She told Nova to give her mother her water. It was a command, not a request. The tone of an adult who expected immediate obedience from a child. But Nova didn't let go. She looked up at Blake, her young face set with determination that seemed far too old for her years. She asked where Blake had gotten this water from. Blake's response came quickly, smoothly, like she'd prepared for this exact question. She said the galley, like all their water. Then she told Nova to stop being difficult. Again that tone. The one that said a child had no business questioning an adult, especially not a child questioning a flight attendant in her own domain. But Nova shook her head. Her voice, when she spoke, was shaking but clear. She said no, Blake didn't get it from the galley. She saw her. The air in the cabin changed. It was subtle at first, but passengers in nearby rows who'd been half listening were now fully tuned in. Rain was looking between her daughter and Blake, confusion morphing into concern. She asked Nova what was wrong. Nova turned to her mother, and in that moment she made a choice. She knew what would happen if she said what she'd seen. She knew adults didn't like being challenged by children. She knew this could go badly. But her mother's life and her baby sibling's life were more important than any of that. Her voice shook, but she said it clearly. She told her mother that Blake had gotten the water from the bathroom. The toilet bathroom. The reaction was immediate. Gasps rippled through the nearby rows. Heads turned. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Lumi behind them made a sound of shock. River's head snapped up from his laptop, his eyes sharp and suddenly very alert. Blake's face flushed a deep, angry red. Her composure cracked for just a second before she forced it back into place. She said that was a serious accusation. Her voice was louder now, carrying to more of the cabin. She said Nova was just a child who didn't understand how airline systems worked. The implication was clear. The child was confused, mistaken, making things up. But River was already standing. He was a tall man, and when he rose to his full height in the cramped cabin, he commanded attention. His voice was calm but carried authority, the voice of someone used to courtrooms and cross-examinations. He said if Nova was wrong, Blake wouldn't mind drinking the water herself to prove the child wrong. The suggestion landed like a bomb. More passengers were paying attention now, craning their necks to see what was happening. The murmurs grew louder. Agreement spread through the crowd. It was such a simple solution. If the water was safe, if it was from the normal supply, Blake could just drink it and end this whole thing. Easy. Blake opened her mouth, then closed it. Her flush deepened. She stammered something about this being ridiculous, about not having to prove anything, but her voice had lost its authority. She sounded defensive now. Rattled. Jed appeared from the forward cabin, drawn by the commotion. His young face was creased with concern as he asked what was going on. He looked between Blake, Nova still clutching the cup, Rain's confused and frightened expression, and the ring of passengers all focused on this one row. Nova was still sitting, but something in her shifted. She set her jaw the way her mother did when she was determined, the way her grandmother did when she was fighting. She stood up on her seat so she could be seen, so she could be heard, this tiny 7-year-old girl in the middle of an airplane cabin holding a cup of water like it was evidence in a trial. Her voice rang out, clear and strong despite the trembling. She said, "I dare you to drink that water if you're innocent." The entire cabin went silent. Not just the nearby rows. The whole section. Conversations died. Babies that had been fussing quieted as if sensing the weight of the moment. Every single eye turned to Blake. Dozens of passengers, all watching, all waiting. Blake stood frozen. All eyes were on her. This was her moment to end it. To prove the child wrong. To take the cup, drink the water, and show everyone that Nova was just a confused little girl who'd misunderstood what she'd seen. But Blake didn't move toward the cup. Her hands had started shaking, subtle tremors she couldn't quite control. Her face had gone from flushed to pale, a sick grayish color that spoke of panic. She said she didn't have to prove anything to a child. But her voice cracked on the word child. It sounded weak. Desperate. Jet stepped closer, his expression shifting from confusion to dawning horror. He spoke quietly, but in the silence of the cabin, everyone heard him. He told Blake to just drink the water and this would be over. It was such a reasonable request. So simple. So easy. If Nova was wrong, if this was all a misunderstanding, one sip would resolve everything. Blake would be vindicated. Nova would be corrected. Life would go on. Blake reached for the cup. Her hand extended, trembling. Nova held it out to her, her young face set with grim determination. Blake's fingers touched the plastic. She lifted it, brought it toward her face. The entire cabin held its breath. Rain had her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face, beginning to understand what had almost happened. Blake brought the cup to her lips. The rim touched her mouth. Her eyes closed. And then she stopped. She just stopped. Froze completely, the cup against her lips but not tilting, not drinking. For 5 seconds she stood like that, like a statue, like someone who'd reached a line they couldn't cross. Then her eyes opened and the cup came away from her mouth, and she set it down abruptly on the tray table. The water sloshed but didn't spill. It sat there, clear and innocent looking, an accusation in physical form. Blake said this was absurd. Her voice was high, stressed, breaking. She said she was calling the captain. She started to back away, to retreat, to escape. Lumi's voice came from behind, quiet but devastating in its certainty. She said Blake couldn't drink it because Blake knew what was in it. River already had his phone out, held high, the camera clearly recording. He announced it to the cabin, his voice firm. He said he was recording this. Everyone here was a witness. His eyes met several other passengers and phones started coming out all around them. Multiple cameras now documenting everything. Blake saw the phones. She saw the passengers closing in, not physically but emotionally, their body language shifting from passive observers to protective allies of Rain and Nova. She saw Jet's face, pale with realization. She saw Nova standing on the seat, this tiny child who just exposed something monstrous. And Blake fled. She turned and pushed through the galley curtain, disappearing into the small space like it could protect her from what was happening. Jet picked up the cup with careful fingers like it might explode. He brought it to his nose and smelled it. His face went pale, then green. He knew that smell. He knew exactly where that water had come from. His hand shook as he set the cup down, and when he looked at Rain and Nova, his eyes were filled with horror and apology. The cabin erupted. Not in chaos but in unified outrage. Passengers who moments before had been strangers absorbed in their own worlds were now connected by shared disgust and protective fury. They surrounded Rain and Nova like a human shield. Lumi had reached forward and put her hand on Nova's shoulder. River was already typing on his phone, likely to a lawyer or the airline or both. Other passengers were sharing contact information, offering to be witnesses, to testify, to help in whatever way they could. The entire airplane had shifted. This wasn't just a flight anymore. This was a crime scene. This was a moment that would be remembered, documented, shared. And at the center of it all was a 7-year-old girl who'd refused to stay silent, who'd trusted her instincts, who'd saved her mother from something unconscionable. Nova was still standing on her seat, still holding herself upright even though her legs were shaking. Rain pulled her daughter down into her arms, holding her tight, sobbing into her hair, whispering thank you over and over. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being brave. Thank you for saving us. And in the galley, behind the curtain, Blake was facing the destruction of everything she'd built over 15 years. Her career. Her reputation. Her freedom. All of it crumbling because she'd let her prejudice, her cruelty, her sense of superiority override every shred of human decency. Because a 7-year-old girl had been paying attention when adults thought children didn't matter. Because Nova had refused to let her mother be hurt. Because sometimes justice comes from the smallest, bravest voices. If this story has your heart pounding and you need to see Blake face the consequences she deserves, smash that subscribe button now, because what happens next when the captain gets involved and the truth fully comes to light will restore your faith that evil doesn't always win. Here's my question for you. Have you ever been in a situation where you knew something was wrong but were afraid to speak up because of who might not believe you? Share your story in the comments, because Nova's courage at just 7 years old might be exactly the reminder you need that your voice matters no matter how small you think it is. Jet moved quickly toward the cockpit, his face pale and set with grim determination. He knocked, was admitted, and disappeared inside. Through the gap in the door before it closed, passengers could see him leaning close to the captain, speaking urgently, his hands gesturing toward the back cabin. Whatever he was saying, it was serious enough that the captain's entire posture changed. Captain Frank emerged less than 2 minutes later. He was a man in his late 50s, gray at the temples, with the kind of weathered face that came from decades of navigating not just aircraft but the complexities of human behavior at altitude. He had the walk of someone used to command, but right now his jaw was tight and his eyes were hard with barely controlled anger. Jet walked beside him, still speaking in low, urgent tones. Frank's expression grew darker with each step toward row 23. When they reached Rain and Nova, still surrounded by protective passengers, Frank's professional mask slipped for just a moment and genuine horror crossed his features. He looked at Rain, at this exhausted, pregnant woman who was shaking in her seat with her daughter clutched tight against her chest, and something in his face softened with profound regret. He introduced himself as Captain Frank, and then he did something that captains almost never do. He apologized. Not a corporate apology, not a carefully worded liability-avoiding statement, but a genuine, profuse human apology. He said he was deeply sorry for what had happened on his aircraft. He said it was inexcusable, unforgivable, and would be dealt with immediately and severely. His voice carried through the cabin, and there was no mistaking the sincerity or the fury barely contained beneath his professional tone. He turned to Jet and gave clear, firm orders. He told him to get Rain proper bottled water, sealed and unopened. Juice. Anything she wanted from the first-class meal service. Whatever would help her feel better, whatever she needed. Jet nodded and practically ran toward the forward galley. Then Frank raised his voice so the entire cabin could hear. He announced that the flight attendant involved, Blake, was removed from duty effective immediately for the remainder of this flight. There would be a full investigation upon landing. His tone made it clear this wasn't a temporary measure. This was the beginning of the end of Blake's career. From behind the galley curtain came Blake's voice, raised in protest. She was saying something about this being an overreaction, about the child being mistaken, about her years of service. Her voice had a desperate edge to it, the sound of someone watching their entire world collapse. Frank's voice cut through her protests like a blade. He told her to go to the crew rest area immediately. Not a request. An order. He said if she refused, he would have her restrained for the safety of the passengers. The threat was clear and backed by absolute authority. The galley curtain rustled, and Blake emerged just long enough to be seen retreating toward the back of the plane, her face blotchy with rage and fear, her carefully maintained composure completely shattered. She disappeared into the crew area, and the door closed behind her with a decisive click. And then something happened that Rain would remember for the rest of her life. The passengers began to applaud. It started with River's slow, deliberate claps. Then Lumi joined in. Then the elderly couple across the aisle. Then more and more until the entire section was applauding, not for the captain but for Nova. This 7-year-old girl who'd stood up when adults had failed. Who'd trusted her instincts when she could have been dismissed as wrong. Who'd protected her mother when the systems meant to protect them both had failed catastrophically. Passengers were looking at Nova with admiration, with respect, with gratitude that someone that young had that much courage. Rain was shaking, holding Nova so tight the little girl could barely breathe. Tears were streaming down Rain's face, but they weren't just tears of relief or residual fear. They were tears of pride and overwhelming love and the slowly sinking realization of what had almost happened. If Nova hadn't been watching. If Nova hadn't asked Jet about the water systems earlier. If Nova hadn't been brave enough to stop her from drinking. The baby. Her pregnancy. The bacteria and contamination from toilet wastewater. She could have gotten desperately ill. She could have lost the baby. She could have ended up hospitalized, septic, fighting for her life. All because one woman had decided that Rain's humanity wasn't worth respecting. The reality was crushing and liberating all at once. It had almost happened. But it didn't. Because her daughter, her brilliant, observant, courageous daughter, had refused to be silent. Jet returned with his arms full. Sealed bottles of water. Cranberry juice. A first-class meal that looked infinitely better than anything in economy. He set it all on the tray table with gentle care, and when he looked at Rain, his eyes were filled with apology and admiration in equal measure. He told her again that he was so sorry, that this should never have happened, that Nova was incredibly brave. Captain Frank stayed for another moment, ensuring Rain had everything she needed, answering her shaky questions about what would happen next. He promised a full investigation. He gave her his direct contact information. He told her the airline would be reaching out, but she should also feel free to pursue any legal action she deemed appropriate. He wasn't protecting the airline. He was protecting what was right. As Frank walked back toward the cockpit, there was a shift in the cabin energy. The immediate crisis had been handled, but there was a sense of unfinished business. Passengers were talking among themselves, sharing their disgust, their support for Rain and Nova. Contact information was being exchanged. People who'd been strangers an hour ago were now united by having witnessed something terrible and wanting to help make it right. That's when Arden appeared. Arden was the flight attendant who'd been working the forward cabin, the one Blake had made that comment to earlier about passengers thinking they deserved personal service. She'd been noticeably absent during the confrontation, and some might have assumed she was avoiding the situation. But now she approached Rain hesitantly, her face pale and drawn with an internal struggle that was written in every line of her expression. She asked Rain quietly if they could speak for a moment. Rain, still holding Nova, nodded and carefully shifted her daughter to the seat beside her. Arden led Rain just a few steps away to the galley entrance, far enough for privacy but still visible to the protective ring of passengers who were keeping watchful eyes on the situation. Arden's voice was low, barely above a whisper, but it trembled with emotion that had clearly been building for a long time. She told Rain she needed to say something. That this wasn't the first time. Rain, still processing everything, asked what she meant. What wasn't the first time? And Arden, with the look of someone unburdening a weight they'd carried far too long, began to speak. She said Blake had done things like this before. Not this exact thing, not toilet water, but cruel things to passengers Blake decided she didn't like. Arden's voice shook as she listed what she'd witnessed over the years working with Blake. She'd seen Blake deliberately forget medications for passengers who needed them, leaving them in pain or distress for hours. She'd seen her ignore call buttons for specific passengers, letting them ring and ring while attending to others. She'd seen Blake lie about wheelchair availability, forcing elderly or disabled passengers to walk long distances when assistance was available. She'd seen her give passengers with allergies meals that contained their allergens and claim it was all they had. She'd seen small cruelties and large ones, all targeted at passengers Blake deemed unworthy of proper service. Rain's face went from confusion to horror to a deep, simmering rage. She asked the question that mattered most. Why didn't you report her? Arden's eyes filled with tears. She said she was scared. Blake had been with the airline longer. Blake had connections with management, friendships with supervisors who dismissed complaints about her. Arden was newer, less secure in her position. She'd convinced herself that reporting Blake would cost her job and accomplish nothing. Blake would get a slap on the wrist at most, and Arden would be branded a troublemaker. But what Blake did to Rain and Nova, Arden said with her voice breaking, she couldn't stay silent anymore. She couldn't live with herself if she didn't speak up now. She told Rain she would testify to everything she'd seen. Every incident. Every cruelty. Every passenger Blake had hurt. She would put it all on record, consequences to her own career be damned. This conversation, conducted in hushed tones near the galley, was nonetheless overheard by River. He'd positioned himself strategically, still recording on his phone, still gathering evidence. When he heard Arden's confession, he nodded in visible support and approval. This was exactly the kind of pattern of behavior evidence that would be crucial. Because River, as it turned out, wasn't just any businessman. When the immediate crisis had passed and things had calmed slightly, he'd approached Rain and introduced himself properly. He handed her a business card with a prestigious law firm's letterhead. River Mason, civil rights attorney, partner. He'd been traveling for work, handling a discrimination case in another state. And now, he told Rain with absolute conviction in his voice, he was looking at another case that demanded justice. He spoke clearly so Rain could understand exactly what she was dealing with. What happened on this flight was criminal. Multiple charges could apply. Assault, because Blake had knowingly provided contaminated water intended for consumption. Child endangerment, because Rain was pregnant and Blake's actions put both Rain and her unborn child at risk. And discrimination, because the pattern of Blake's behavior and the specific targeting of Rain suggested racial animus. River told Rain he would represent her pro bono. No charge. This case mattered. This case was exactly the kind of injustice he'd spent his career fighting. And he wanted to fight it for her. Rain was overwhelmed, barely able to process the offer, but she took his card with shaking hands. River also told her he'd already been documenting everything. He had video. He had audio. He had timestamps. And he had a plane full of witnesses. As if on cue, Lumi appeared, along with several other passengers from surrounding rows. They all offered to be witnesses. They gave Rain their contact information, their phone numbers, their email addresses. They told her what they'd seen, what they'd heard. They corroborated the timeline. They described Blake's demeanor, her words, her actions. They talked about how Blake had refused to drink the water, how that refusal was as good as a confession. An older man who'd been sitting 3 rows back said he'd worked in aviation maintenance for 30 years. He knew about airplane water systems. He'd testify about the difference between potable water and lavatory water, about the contamination risks, about why what Blake did was so dangerous. A woman traveling with her own young daughter said she'd testify about the trauma this could cause a child, about how Nova would likely need therapy to process what she'd witnessed and the burden of having to protect her mother that way. The circle of support was growing, solidifying. Rain wasn't alone in this. Nova wasn't alone. They had an army of strangers who'd become allies, who'd seen injustice and decided they couldn't just walk away. Nova, watching all of this, tugged on Jet's sleeve. He knelt down to her level and she asked him a direct question in that clear, curious way children have. She asked him to explain exactly where the water Blake had used came from. Jet looked around, saw River still recording, saw the gathered witnesses, and understood that what he said now would matter. He spoke clearly, on record, with no room for misinterpretation. He confirmed that based on what Nova had described seeing and where she'd seen Blake filling the cup, the water came from the lavatory service tap. That tap was part of the gray water system used to service the toilet waste system. It was not potable water. It was not safe for consumption. It contained bacteria, waste particles, and chemical cleaning agents. It should never, under any circumstances, be given to a passenger to drink. The crowd of witnesses absorbed this technical confirmation with grim satisfaction. It wasn't speculation. It wasn't a child's misunderstanding. It was confirmed by a crew member on record. But Jet wasn't done. He looked at Rain and said something else, something that clearly cost him to admit. He said he'd been documenting Blake's behavior in incident reports for over a year. Every time he witnessed something inappropriate, something cruel, he'd filed a report with management. And every single report had been ignored. He'd reported Blake being dismissive of passenger needs. He'd reported her making inappropriate comments about passengers based on their appearance or perceived economic status. He'd reported her refusing to provide adequate service to specific individuals. And nothing had happened. No disciplinary action. No retraining. Not even a conversation as far as he knew. His reports had disappeared into some administrative void, and Blake had continued exactly as before. Jet said he was willing to testify to all of it. He'd bring his copies of the reports. He'd detail every incident. He'd tell the truth about a system that had protected Blake while leaving passengers vulnerable. And if it cost him his job, so be it. He couldn't be part of protecting someone who just tried to poison a pregnant woman. The plane was beginning its descent. The landing was approaching. But everyone in that section of the aircraft understood that the real journey was just beginning. The legal battle. The media attention. The fight for accountability and justice. Blake was still sequestered in the crew rest area, her 15-year career in ruins, facing criminal charges and civil liability that would destroy her financially and personally. Arden was preparing to be a whistleblower, to expose years of ignored complaints and systemic failures. Jet was ready to testify against his own employer's negligence. River was already building a case that would make headlines and likely force industry-wide policy changes. And Rain and Nova, the mother and daughter who just wanted to visit a sick grandmother, were at the center of a storm that would change lives, end careers, and hopefully make flying safer and more equitable for every passenger who came after them. The wheels touched down in Atlanta. The plane taxied to the gate. But for the people in row 23 and everyone who'd witnessed what happened there, the landing was just the beginning. Because sometimes justice doesn't end when the plane lands. Sometimes it's just taking off. If you want to see how Blake faces the full weight of the law and how Nova's story changes airline policy forever, you need to subscribe right now because the final chapter of this story will show you that standing up to injustice, no matter how scary, is always worth it. Let me ask you this. If you witnessed something like this happening to someone else, would you step up and offer to be a witness? Or would you convince yourself it's not your business and walk away? Be honest in the comments because the passengers on Flight 447 made a choice that day to not be silent bystanders. And that choice is what turned a near tragedy into a victory for justice. The plane came to a complete stop at the gate, but the seatbelt sign remained illuminated. Captain Frank's voice came over the intercom, calm but firm, instructing all passengers to remain seated. There would be a brief delay before deplaning. No explanation was given, but everyone in the back section knew exactly why. Within minutes, airline security personnel boarded the aircraft. They weren't the typical customer service representatives who occasionally help with luggage or wheelchair assistance. These were actual security officers, 2 of them, moving with purpose down the aisle toward the crew rest area. The entire cabin had gone silent, passengers watching with a mixture of satisfaction and morbid curiosity. The crew rest area door opened. Blake emerged, flanked by the security officers. She was no longer in her pristine flight attendant uniform. Somewhere in the past hour she'd changed into civilian clothes, or maybe she'd been ordered to remove the uniform that represented an airline that no longer wanted to be associated with her. Her face was blotchy, her eyes red-rimmed, her carefully maintained appearance completely shattered. She tried to maintain some dignity as she walked down that long aisle. She kept her chin up, her eyes forward, refusing to make eye contact with any of the passengers who lined the route like spectators at a perp walk. But there was no dignity to be found. Everyone knew what she'd done. Everyone had seen her refuse to drink that water. Everyone understood that she was being removed not just from the flight but from her entire career. As she passed row 23, she couldn't help herself. Her eyes flicked toward Rain and Nova for just a fraction of a second. Whatever she saw in their faces made her look away quickly, her composure cracking further. Nova stared back at her with those observant 7-year-old eyes, not with triumph or gloating, but with something more devastating. Disappointment. The kind of look a child gives an adult who's failed to be what adults are supposed to be. Blake was escorted off the plane, down the jetway, and into whatever legal and professional nightmare awaited her. The door closed behind her and the cabin seemed to collectively exhale. But Captain Frank wasn't done. He personally came back to escort Rain and Nova off the aircraft first, before any other passengers. He explained that airport medical personnel were waiting to examine them, just as a precaution. Rain tried to protest that she felt fine now, but Frank was insistent. Given what had almost happened, given the pregnancy, they needed to be checked. It wasn't optional. Rain and Nova were led off the plane by Frank himself, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by the other passengers who began applauding again as they departed. They were taken through the terminal, past the waiting areas where other passengers stared curiously, and into a private medical facility that airports maintain for emergencies. The examination was thorough. A doctor checked Rain's vitals, listened to the baby's heartbeat, asked detailed questions about how she was feeling. The baby's heart rate was strong and steady, a sound that made Rain break down crying all over again because it could have been so different. Her own vitals were good, blood pressure slightly elevated from stress but otherwise normal. The doctor confirmed what Rain desperately needed to hear. Both she and the baby were fine. Nova received her own examination, though more psychological than physical. The paramedics praised her quick thinking and bravery. They told her she'd likely saved her mother and baby sibling from serious illness. They asked if she understood what she'd done, and Nova, with that matter-of-fact clarity children sometimes have, said she'd stopped her mom from drinking bad water because that's what you do when someone you love is in danger. One of the paramedics had tears in her eyes when Nova said that. She told Nova she was the bravest 7-year-old she'd ever met. While Rain and Nova were being examined, something was happening outside the medical facility. News crews had arrived. Airport reporters who monitor police scanners and have contacts with airline staff had caught wind of something extraordinary happening on Flight 447. They didn't have all the details yet, but they had enough to know it was a story. Cameras were being set up near the terminal exit. Reporters were preparing for whatever emerged. What they didn't know yet was that the story was already viral. Multiple passengers from Flight 447 had posted their videos to social media while still on the plane, using the airport Wi-Fi the moment they'd landed. Videos of Nova standing on her seat, holding that cup of water, daring Blake to drink it. Videos of Blake's refusal. Videos of the applause for Nova. Videos of Blake being escorted off in disgrace. The hashtags were already trending. Justice at 30,000 feet. Flight attendant exposed. 7-year-old hero. The videos were being shared thousands of times, then tens of thousands, the outrage and support spreading across the internet like wildfire. By the time Rain and Nova emerged from the medical facility, the story had already been picked up by local news, then regional news, and was climbing toward national attention. River met them as they exited, having positioned himself as a buffer between them and the cameras. He quietly asked Rain if she wanted to speak to the press or avoid them entirely. Rain, exhausted and overwhelmed, just wanted to get to her mother's house. River nodded, put himself between the cameras and his new clients, and helped them navigate to ground transportation while deflecting reporter questions with practiced ease. But the story was out there now, and it was growing. 3 weeks passed. 3 weeks during which the world watched what happened when institutions were forced to confront their failures publicly. The airline moved first, trying to get ahead of the narrative. They released a statement announcing that Blake had been terminated effective immediately. The language was carefully crafted by lawyers. Violation of safety protocols and passenger care standards. They didn't mention race. They didn't mention the toilet water specifically. They tried to make it sound like a routine disciplinary matter. But the internet wasn't having it. The videos were everywhere. The details were known. The airline was forced to release a second statement, this one more honest, acknowledging the severity of what had occurred and promising a comprehensive review of their training and reporting procedures. Criminal charges were filed by the district attorney. 2 counts, assault and reckless endangerment. The prosecutor's statement was clear. Blake had knowingly provided contaminated water to a pregnant woman, putting both the woman and her unborn child at risk of serious illness. This wasn't a civil matter. This was a crime. River filed the civil lawsuit on behalf of Rain, and the complaint was devastating in its detail. It named Blake personally and the airline corporately. It alleged discrimination, negligence, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and assault. It detailed not just what happened on Flight 447, but the pattern of behavior that Arden's testimony had revealed. Because Arden had kept her promise. She'd come forward officially, providing a sworn statement that documented years of Blake's misconduct. She detailed specific incidents, named other victims where she could remember them, and explained how she'd been too afraid to report it because of the power dynamics and the airline's history of dismissing complaints about senior staff. Her testimony opened floodgates. Other victims of Blake's treatment started coming forward. A man who'd been denied his insulin on a flight and nearly went into diabetic shock. An elderly woman who'd been told no wheelchairs were available and had fallen trying to walk to her gate, later discovering several wheelchairs had been available. A family whose child's severe peanut allergy had been ignored, resulting in an emergency landing. One after another they came forward with their stories. And each story showed the same pattern. Blake targeting passengers she deemed unworthy. Blake using her position of power to inflict small cruelties and large ones. And the airline systematically ignoring complaints. The airline was facing a public relations nightmare and legal liability that extended far beyond just Rain's case. They were now being scrutinized for their entire complaint handling process. Why had Jet's incident reports been ignored? Why had passenger complaints about Blake not resulted in any action? How many other flight attendants were treating passengers this way? Regulatory agencies got involved. The FAA started asking questions about training and oversight. Disability rights organizations filed formal complaints. Civil rights groups demanded industry-wide reforms. Meanwhile, Jet received a formal commendation from the airline. It was clear damage control, trying to show they valued employees who did the right thing, but it was also genuine. Jet had tried to report problems through proper channels and had been ignored. Now he was being held up as an example of what crew members should be. 6 months later, he'd be promoted to lead flight attendant, specifically assigned to help redesign training protocols around passenger care and discrimination prevention. The airline implemented new systems. Mandatory anti-discrimination training for all crew. A new reporting system where complaints about crew behavior went to an independent third-party investigator, not internal management. New protocols for serving passengers with medical needs. Random audits of flight attendant behavior. It wasn't enough to undo the harm, but it was something. And it happened because one 7-year-old hadn't stayed silent. 3 months after Flight 447, Rain went into labor. It was a cool November evening, and Nova was at her grandmother's house when she got the call that it was time. Her grandmother, stronger now after finishing her cancer treatment, drove Nova to the hospital where they found Rain in a delivery room, surrounded by excellent medical care, safe and supported. The birth was smooth, healthy. A baby boy, 7 pounds and 4 ounces, with a strong cry in his mother's eyes. Rain held him, tears streaming down her face, overcome with joy and relief and the weight of everything that could have gone wrong but hadn't. When they asked her what she wanted to name him, Rain didn't hesitate. River. She named him River, after the attorney who'd stood up for her when she was at her most vulnerable, who'd fought for her pro bono, who'd helped turn her trauma into justice. River Mason, the attorney, would later say it was the greatest honor of his career. Nova was allowed into the room to meet her baby brother. She stood on a stool next to the hospital bed, peering down at this tiny human who was part of her family now. Rain pulled Nova close with her free arm, holding both her children, and thanked her daughter for saving them both. Nova looked up at her mother with those serious eyes and said something Rain would never forget. She said she'd just done what Rain had always taught her. To speak up when something was wrong. That staying silent when people were being hurt wasn't being polite, it was being complicit. Nova said she'd just been doing what Mama taught her. Rain sobbed, holding her daughter tight, realizing that every lesson she tried to teach, every value she tried to instill, had taken root in this incredible child. Nova had listened. She'd learned. And when it mattered most, she'd been brave. The settlement came through that same month. The airline settled for an undisclosed amount, but court documents that were briefly public before being sealed suggested it was substantial. 7 figures. Enough to change Rain's life completely. Blake settled separately, forced to liquidate her assets to pay her portion. Her legal fees for the criminal defense had already bankrupted her. She lost her house, her retirement savings, everything. She was facing potential jail time, though ultimately she'd receive probation and community service as part of a plea deal that required her to admit guilt. But her life as she'd known it was over. Some people might have felt sympathy for how far she'd fallen. But then they'd remember what she'd done. They'd remember that cup of toilet water. They'd remember a pregnant woman begging for basic decency. They'd remember a 7-year-old having to protect her mother from an adult in a position of trust. And the sympathy would evaporate. Rain used the settlement money wisely. She finished her nursing degree, the one she'd had to put on hold when she got pregnant with Nova. She started a college fund for both children that would ensure they'd never have to struggle the way she had. She bought a modest house with a yard where Nova and River could play safely. She donated a portion to organizations fighting discrimination in transportation. And she kept River Mason's card, because she'd learned that having good people in your corner mattered more than anything. Nova was invited to speak at her school about what had happened. The principal thought it would be a good lesson for the other students about courage and standing up for what's right. Nova, nervous but determined, stood in front of an assembly and told her story. She explained what she'd seen, what she'd done, why it mattered. She told them that adults don't always do the right thing, and sometimes kids have to be the ones to speak up. She told them that being scared and being brave weren't opposites. You could be both. She was terrified on that plane, but she spoke up anyway because her mom needed her. The students listened with rapt attention. Some of the teachers were crying. And when Nova finished, the entire school gave her a standing ovation that lasted so long the principal had to eventually quiet them down. Nova had become more than just a girl who'd stopped her mother from drinking contaminated water. She'd become a symbol. A reminder that courage doesn't have an age requirement. That observation matters. That children's voices carry truth even when adults try to dismiss them. Her story was shared in diversity training seminars, in ethics classes, in discussions about discrimination and power dynamics and the importance of speaking up. Flight 447 became a case study in what happens when institutional systems fail and individual courage succeeds. The airline industry changed because of what happened. Multiple carriers revised their policies. Training programs were redesigned. Reporting systems were overhauled. It wasn't perfect and discrimination didn't disappear, but it was harder now. More difficult for people like Blake to abuse their power. More likely that victims would be heard and believed. All because a 7-year-old girl had paid attention when adults thought children didn't matter. In the hospital room, holding her newborn son, with her daughter pressed against her side and her mother sitting in the corner with tears of joy streaming down her face, Rain thought about everything that had led to this moment. The cruelty she'd faced. The fear she'd felt. The courage her daughter had shown. The justice they'd fought for and won. She thought about how close they'd come to tragedy. How different this moment could have been if Nova hadn't been watching, hadn't been brave, hadn't trusted her instincts. She kissed the top of Nova's head and whispered thank you one more time. And Nova, 7 years old and already wiser than many adults would ever be, simply snuggled closer to her mother and baby brother and smiled. Because she knew something that the world was just learning. That doing the right thing wasn't always easy. That standing up to injustice could be terrifying. That speaking truth to power might cost you something. But it was always worth it. The story of Flight 447 spread far beyond that single airplane, far beyond that single day. It became a reminder that discrimination still happens in everyday spaces. In the sky, on the ground, in places where we're taught to trust that people in authority will treat us fairly. It doesn't always happen. And when it doesn't, silence is complicity. But the story also became a reminder of something more hopeful. That children see what adults miss. That young voices carry power when we listen to them. That one moment of courage can create ripples that turn into waves that change entire systems. Nova had been taught by her mother to speak up when something was wrong. And when the moment came when everything was on the line, she'd done exactly that. She'd refused to stay silent. She'd refused to let her mother be harmed. She'd stood up to an adult in uniform with all the authority that uniform carried, and she'd demanded justice. And she'd won. Not just for herself and her mother, but for every passenger who'd ever been mistreated and told they were overreacting. For every complaint that had been filed and ignored. For every person who'd experienced discrimination at 30,000 feet and thought there was nothing they could do about it. Nova had shown them there was something they could do. They could speak up. They could stand firm. They could demand better. They could refuse to accept cruelty as the price of traveling while black or disabled, or different in any way that made them a target. The witnesses on Flight 447 had shown something too. That when you see injustice happening to someone else, you have a choice. You can look away, tell yourself it's not your business, protect your own comfort by staying silent. Or you can step up, offer to testify, give your contact information, use your privilege or your position or simply your willingness to tell the truth to help someone who needs it. River had shown it. Lumi had shown it. Jet had shown it. Arden had shown it. The passengers who'd filmed and shared and offered to be witnesses had shown it. They'd all made a choice to not be bystanders. And that choice had made all the difference. Flight 447 changed policies across the industry. New training protocols. New reporting systems. New accountability measures. Airlines started taking discrimination complaints seriously because they'd seen what happened when they didn't. When complaints were ignored, when bad actors were protected, when victims were dismissed. They'd seen careers destroyed. Lawsuits won. Criminal charges filed. Public outrage mobilized. And they'd learned that the cost of ignoring injustice was far higher than the cost of addressing it. All because one 7-year-old refused to stay silent. In the years to come, Nova would grow up carrying the weight and the gift of what she'd done. Some days it would feel heavy being known as the girl from Flight 447. But most days it would feel like purpose. Like she'd learned young what some people never learn at all. That her voice mattered. That courage was possible. That standing up for what's right even when you're small and scared could change the world. And baby River would grow up hearing the story of how he got his name. How his big sister had saved him before he was even born. How their mother had fought for justice and won. How a community of strangers had become allies. How one terrible moment had transformed into something powerful and lasting. The story of Flight 447 would be told and retold. In classrooms and courtrooms. In training sessions and family dinners. In moments when people needed to remember that injustice doesn't have to win. That courage doesn't require perfection, just persistence. That sometimes the smallest voices carry the most important truths. And somewhere, on flights across the country and around the world, passengers would be treated a little better. Flight attendants would think twice before letting prejudice guide their actions. Complaints would be taken seriously. Victims would be believed. Systems would be just a little more fair. Not perfect, never perfect, but better. All because Nova had been paying attention. Because she'd trusted what she saw. Because she'd loved her mother enough to be brave. Because she'd refused to let cruelty win. If this story has moved you, if Nova's courage has inspired you, if you believe that speaking up against injustice matters no matter how small you think your voice is, then subscribe right now because stories like this remind us why we can never afford to stay silent when we see wrong being done. Here's the question I want you to really think about. When was the last time you saw something wrong happening and had to choose between the comfort of staying silent and the courage of speaking up? What did you choose, and if you could go back, would you do anything differently? Share your truth in the comments because every story of courage, big or small, matters and might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to find their own brave voice.